Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for this live stream presentation in collaboration with the Los Alamos Mountaineers. This virtual event is being brought to you by the Pajarito Environmental Education Center, or PEEC, which operates the Los Alamos Nature Center. The Nature Center is now open to the public. We have lots more hours. And so check out our website, that's peaknature.org. For the current hours and more live stream presentations and even more live in-person presentations coming, just like this one. I just want to give a quick shout out to all of our wonderful members, our donors, volunteers, and staff who really are making this all possible and have been working so hard over the past year, and they're getting us going, keeping us going, and gonna get us back to in person, to seeing all your wonderful faces here soon. All right, and with that, I will pass it over to Melanie to start the Mountaineers meeting.
Thank you, Beth. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Los Alamos Mountaineers Club meeting for June. I just have a couple of messages before we start with our presentation and some of the other items on our agenda for tonight. Just have a safety minute. Basically, try to be aware that we have hazardous weather conditions going on right now, both heat and lightning. And, try to follow all the protocol for dealing with heat, so you don't end up in a heat stress situation when you're out there in the outdoors. Los Alamos Mountaineers trips are basically following CDC and New Mexico Department of Health guidelines. So hopefully you'll see more trips open up in the near future for everybody's participation. In addition, we just found out some news that the Rio Grande chapter of Sierra Club is also opening up for activities. So, you might want to look into that organization as well if you are interested in getting out and doing some extra activities. Now I'll turn it over to Zach Baker, our past president. He will be giving us the trip reports and upcoming trip announcements, as well as introduce our main presentation tonight. So Zach.
Hello, everyone. So as Melanie said, we are opening up a little bit, and this has led to some club-sponsored activities. First one, Sylvie Adams led a 9-mile loop at Banco Bonito in the Caldera. Everyone said it was a lovely time out, pleasant weather. I led the 13th annual Rio Grande Rubber Ducky trip. So we carry all of our floaties down the Red Dot Trail and hike up to the Blue Dot and float back down. Very pleasant in the very hot weather, although the hike out was a bit warm. In addition, a bunch of people did individual trips this month, including Jeff Click led a Ute Mound 3-day kayak trip. This is up by the Colorado border, kind of across the river from Antonito, and 3 days of pretty pleasant floating and class 1, barely 2 rapids, and a little otter down here that was sunning himself on a rock for 20 minutes while we ate dinner. It was pretty nice. Dave Brown did a nice hike at San Kawi. Olivia Lee led a backpacking trip for 3 days in San Pedro Parks. Saw a lot of great scenery. Gene Dewart and friends went up to Buffalo Peaks, Colorado. This is right outside of Buena Vista, and saw some good 13er scenery. Melanie Hand, our fearless leader, led a canyoneering trip to an area near Abiquiu Lake and did some interesting rappels out there and some canyons that very few people really get to check out. Chris Swanson sent in a few photographs from his favorite summer place, the Rio Guadalupe in the Jemez Mountains. And we still have some upcoming trips. Those previous ones from the Mountaineers were posted and happened pretty much within a week. So everything else is kind of a little longer range. We've got some Bill Podorski ambitious trips, including the Selway River, which is full. A llama supported trip to Anton Ridge, Utah. There was 4 openings. So if you're interested in that, do email Bill. And the 2021 in November Moab, Utah bike hike trip. This is another one of Bill's base camp trips where they get a house and go out for day trips. It's full, but there's a waiting list. But if you're interested, send an email. Maybe you'll get it. If you're interested in leading a trip, we can help. Anywhere you want to go, even if it's a short day hike, put it on the website and other people can go along. Meet new people, make new friends. Email Cecile or email me, and we'll get you set up with a website so that you can get friends. Ben Bergen is a computational scientist at the laboratory, holds a PhD in computational science and computer science. Ben is also a professional photographer, and we'll see a lot of the results of his work here today. But most importantly, Ben is trying to pursue his wife's true goal of doing all of the 14ers in Colorado. Corey finished quite a while ago. Ben's got one more. We should all be grateful for him, though, that in pursuing all of the 14ers, he has amassed a great deal of experience and safety minutes to share with us today. Unfortunately, I will probably be featured in a couple of photographs of people that are deeply unprepared and or underdressed for the weather. But let's all welcome Ben, and thank you for stepping up and giving this talk on pretty short notice, Ben.
Yeah, thank you. No problem. Hi, everyone. I am Ben Bergen. I wasn't sure what to say about myself. Zach said I'm a computational scientist. I work at Los Alamos. My wife, Corey, actually has not done all of the 14ers. She has 3 more to do, but we're going to do 2 of them in August, the Bell's Traverse, and then we have to do Long's Peak to finish up. We have 2 dogs, Beulah and Jax. Beulah has done, I think, 15 14ers, and Jax has just did his first 14er last fall as a moonlight hike of Chavano. We're living in Boulder, Colorado, and we sort of leveraged the COVID to move and be able to telecommute, and we actually are going to move to Leadville, Colorado when our house gets built, which is supposed to be in October, but we'll see. My first 14er was Mount Sherman. I think it was in 1993. That's a pretty good one to start out with, and I'll talk about some easy ones to start with. And then I thought my favorite beer is apropos because it's elevated IPA from La Cumbre. So this is, I don't claim to be the definitive authority by any means on climbing 14er, so I thought I would just put these references first. I don't think I've ever done a 14er without looking at Jerry Roach's Colorado 14ers guidebook. That is an excellent reference. It has all of the standard routes and basically any other route that you'd like to do with accurate descriptions and information. And you can get that in paperbook at Amazon. And then the other really good reference is 14ers.com website. They have routes with good photographs and description of sort of the landmark points along the route and the cruxes and ratings and information. as well as weather reports. So you can get the forecast. They have gear lists. I'm going to try and stay away from just doing laundry lists of things that you should do or take or think about during this talk, and stick to more kind of anecdotal experience information. But you can get all of that for summer and winter. I guess the other thing is that I'm mainly going to talk about kind of summer considerations. There are a whole slew of things that you have to think about for doing winter 14ers. And so that would be a whole nother talk, but there is information on 14ers.com about that. Other good reference is trip reports, a good resource, because you can find out what kind of the latest conditions are, things that may change since it's a dynamic situation. And then there are forums for asking people questions and getting more in-depth information. Okay, so I'm going to go through the basics. I don't want anyone to get the idea that 14ers are super treacherous most of the time. Even if you're unprepared, things go okay, and it's only very seldom that people get injured or killed doing 14ers. But I am going to talk about the risks that are involved and how you can plan so that you can, and prepare so that you can mitigate the risks. So don't think that everything's awful when you go up on these things. The first thing that I put is know the route. And I thought about this what the most important thing that I thought you should know. And it's really where you're going and what the route is, because many of the accidents, if not most of them, happen because somebody is off route. And even on kind of the easier 14ers, if you're not on the standard route, or at least a route, you can get into dangerous situations quickly. And the canonical example of that now, since 2017, is that 5 people died on Capitol in sort of a 2-month period. And one of them was actually, I think, had the proper experience and the climbing skills that he needed, and it was just an accident. But 4 of the people were, I think, first timers, and of those 4, 3 of them were killed because they tried to go down what they thought was an easier route than the way that they had come up. And so, I have this emphatic statement here. If there were an easier route than the standard route, it would be the standard route. So a lot of these things, you need to study the route and make sure that you know where you're going and try to identify what the challenges are. Anecdotally, this is Corey, who's my main subject here for the example of mainly what to do. This is on the Wilson El Diente Traverse, which the Traverse is probably mostly class 3. And I think when you go up Wilson, which is this peak over on the right, there's one class 4 move that you have to do. But we had gone across the Traverse and we were just below the summit of Wilson when we ran into 4 or 5 people in a group who were about to start out across the Traverse because they had come up a route from Navajo Lake and they didn't like it, and they really didn't feel comfortable with the difficulty of doing that climb. And I think one of them had done a 14er before, but several of them, it was their first 14er. And I mean, this is a fairly exposed, committed climb that would take a long time to get back from. And they were going to start out across the Traverse, which really doesn't have any exit route. So once you're on the Traverse, you're committed to going across it. And fortunately, I guess for them, we ran into them, and I had printed out the routes for actually all of the possible routes because we weren't sure exactly what we were going to do. And I had studied them. And so we gave them information and told them not to go out across the traverse and to go down. Presumably, they all made it safely, because I didn't read about anyone getting injured on that. But the point is that knowing the route before you get up there is really kind of the most important thing. A lot of times the weather cooperates, and it's mostly people don't fall or get hit on the head with rocks. And so knowing the route is kind of the main thing, I think, to concentrate on if you're planning to do one of these hikes. This one, Know Your Party, I added after looking at 14ers.com and their advice. The first bullet point is sort of verbatim. It says to travel with experienced people, which made me think of this quote that I think Zach has said before, that good judgment comes from experience and experience comes from bad judgment. So I don't know, experienced people maybe should be in quotes for this, but it is good to go with somebody who's done a 14er before, and maybe even has done the one that you're planning to do if it's your first time. I think another important thing is to try and develop relationships with people doing easier hikes and climbs so that you know them pretty well. I mean, it's okay to go on a planned trip with people maybe who you don't know if there's a strong leader who you really trust, but it's good to have people with a similar fitness level. And then I put a similar tolerance for risk, which doesn't just mean that they have a low tolerance for risk. It's more that you have compatibility as hiking partners or companions. If somebody is super gung-ho and a big risk taker, that would be uncomfortable for someone who's not, and really sort of vice versa. Like if you're comfortable with a certain level of risk and your climbing partner isn't, that can be bad too, because you're not going to agree on the decisions that you need to make. So I think it's good to have those similarities. And the fitness thing is, if you're not very fit or you're super fit, you're going to end up either feeling like you're always behind or waiting for someone else. So it's nice to have good climbing partners who kind of match your abilities. I think the third bullet point, to know and trust people. If you're on one of these climbs and you start to feel sick or bad, or you're uncomfortable or nervous about the climb, you need to feel confident in communicating that to your companions so that you get what you need, and that you can make decisions that are good decisions based on how everyone feels, since physical kind of well-being is important for being successful in these. The last thing is to be aware that a group can be good. I think I've read that a group of 3 or 4 people is kind of the ideal one, because if one person is injured, then you can have another person stay with them and then have 1 or 2 people go out to try to get help or rescue. The caveat is that if you have a large group, then sometimes you can make really risky or really conservative decisions that are not the best decision, or the decision that individual or smaller group might make. So it's something to be aware of. And if you think that you're in a group that is making a bad decision, then you should speak up. I recall going on a backcountry ski trip with Zach Baker, and we were going up to Betty Bear Hut, and we came to a point where we either had to go up sort of just this wall of a climb to go on the winter route to the hut. And we decided to try and go do the summer route. And so we hiked for maybe 1.5 miles farther along on the summer route. And we got to a point where we made a good decision after actually having made a bad decision, that there was a good reason that the summer route was not the winter route, mostly because of avalanche danger. And we turned back. But I think part of why we made that decision was that we had a couple of people who were interested in going and avoiding the steepness of the winter route, which sounds sort of odd, but there was less avalanche danger on that route versus going on the summer route, which is sort of less steep on the route itself, but went through dangerous avalanche terrain. And because of making the bad decision, we ended up having to do sort of an extra 3 miles to get into the hut. But there are group dynamics, even with people who you know well and trust, that can lead to bad decisions. So it's just something to be aware of. I saw on the one slide that talking about lightning being an issue. So the main thing that at least I knew before I started doing 14ers was that you're supposed to get up early in the morning. And that's driven primarily by the monsoon weather pattern where you have clear skies at dawn and then you get afternoon clouds and then thunderstorms, and lightning is a real danger and it claims some lives, not every year, but certainly has done. The placard on the right image here for Catherine Pugan is someone who is on Mount Princeton, and the plaque is actually right where she was struck near the summit of Princeton and killed by lightning. So it's good to, you don't always have to get up at 4 in the morning or whatever crack of dawn. There are some days where it stays clear all day and you could be out the whole day without any problems. But in general, especially in July and August, when many people are doing 14ers, it's important to try to make sure that you at least have the option to be back below tree line before noon. If you get up on the summit and it's bright clear and there are no clouds, you can hang out. Or, sometimes if you're doing a traverse or something that's going to take longer, you need to think carefully about starting something like that and make sure that the conditions are right. But most of the time, if you start early, rule of thumb, maybe a couple of hours before sunrise, then you can get up and get back down below tree line before the weather becomes a problem. I would recommend checking the weather forecast. Another thing where 14ers.com website has up-to-date information. And if it starts to look bad, don't hesitate to turn around. I've turned around on several climbs because the weather looked bad and gone back down. Then another point that I saw on 14ers.com is that most GPS units have barometric pressure, and so if the pressure is going down, then that could mean that a storm is coming in. So there's some tools that you can use to try and do stuff. Sorry, my dogs decided to start fighting right now while I'm talking. Bring the right gear. My favorite piece of gear is really just a shell. I think it's incredibly useful. It would be the main thing that I would want to have, like a really good one that's sort of triple ply Gore-Tex, waterproof, breathable. They're lightweight. They're good protection from sun, wind. If it starts raining or sleeting or snowing, having that shell is good protection against the elements. So I think that's the first thing that I put on my list. And I mean, this list that I have here is stuff that I always carry. I don't always take a helmet. It really depends on the route, whether it's a technical route and whether there's an actual rockfall danger. But if there is, then certainly wear a helmet. Headlamp, if you get stuck out after it's dark, it's good to have a headlamp, and it's just good anyway. I always take, I like a down jacket. In the summer, I take a lightweight down jacket. In the winter, I take a heavier one. The reasoning there is if you get stuck somewhere and you have to hunker down, you can put your down jacket on and put your shell over it, and you're probably not going to freeze to death unless it really, really gets cold. Hat is always good. In the summer, a lot of times I'll take a sun hat or rain hat. I have the hat that I'm wearing in that picture is, I think, Mountain Hardwear hat that I've had for a long time. I don't like gloves very much, but I take lightweight ones for really early morning. It can be chilly, and so I'll wear gloves, but I usually after 10 minutes or so of hiking, I get hot and I'll take them off. Synthetic layers. I mean, this is all stuff I think that you can look at the 14ers.com gear list, and it has the list. To some extent, what you take depends on what you think you want to take. So getting some experience in hiking in low risk situations, you can kind of figure out what you like. It's good to have for sure a water treatment of some kind, either iodine tablets or maybe a UV stick, and then a first aid kit. But those are things that you have to decide what you want to take. It's good to not go too lightweight. Some people use the move or die philosophy, which means you either keep moving or potentially you die. Not quite that. I don't mind carrying 15 pounds or so. So mostly I'm carrying water and then some lightweight gear, but there's not a right thing, and there are certainly things that you could add to this list. I guess that said, Zach referenced this. We did a trip to do Harvard to Columbia, which has a nice little traverse, and I think it must have been in early October. And so when we hiked in, the top two pictures on the left, it was sunny and it was warm and it looked all nice. And there's Zach Baker sitting at the campsite in the sun. And you would hope that he would be looking at and studying the route that we were going to do, but I actually think he was reading technical paper for work. But anyway, we woke up the next morning and it looked like the bottom left picture. So it had snowed overnight, and it couldn't have been more than 20 degrees. So the temperature dropped quite a lot. And I guess the other thing was that it was quite windy, especially near the peak of Harvard. There were maybe 30-mile-an-hour winds. So it was pretty cold. And you can see Zach Baker huddled in this little rock shelter from the wind. So, I mean, really neither one of us were completely prepared for the weather. So this is an example of bad judgment making maybe a good experience. It warmed up enough and the sun came out that we were able to keep doing the hike, especially once we got past Harvard. We started going down the ridge in between Harvard and Columbia, and at some point we got over onto the north side of the ridge and it wasn't as windy, so it got more comfortable. But it's definitely something to be aware of, again, for weather and gear, is that it can snow just about any time on a 14er, and especially if you're going in September or October and kind of pushing the summer nice weather, it can go pretty quickly from one extreme to another. And so it's just something to be aware of. For food and hydration, you should bring water, you should bring water treatment. But otherwise, I think you really have to, this is something that you just have to figure out. There's not a right amount of food. I don't like to eat a lot while I'm doing 14ers. I usually will take maybe a Cliff Bar and then a bunch of gels, because your body can't actually digest a sandwich or something while you're hiking, probably. And most of the time, at least for me, that makes me feel sick. I mean, that said, this is a picture of my friend Paul eating one of his 2 sandwiches that he brought. So some people, I think, benefit from having heartier food along the way. it doesn't matter exactly what it is that you take, as long as it's something that you like to eat, that you can get down when you're doing pretty intense exercise. So, I mean, another thing I take is juji fruits that I like to eat. If you take your dog, make sure that you take a dog dish and you have enough water, or there is enough water for your dog to drink. And then, you know, you need some kind of food probably for your dog, some kind of treat. I guess, like, about dogs, you really have to make sure that if you're going to take your dog, that you've thought out the route well, and that it's a route that is okay for a dog to go on. Some of the routes are too technical. There are dogs who've done all of the standard routes on 14ers, so it's possible. I think if your dog is, you know, doesn't mind heights and climbing around and stuff, or maybe if it's a little dog and you can just stick it in your pack. But if your dog gets hurt, then you have tough decisions, because if it's, I mean, my dog Beulah weighs 75 pounds. There's no way I could pack her out from a 14er. So I've only really taken her on things that are class 1 and 2. And I try to read up about it. Usually you can find information about whether a dog can do well on a particular hike. That's just something to think about. So altitude sickness is definitely a real possibility. I have maybe 3 instances where that's been an issue on a climb. One of them was for me, where I was either dehydrated or had kind of mild altitude sickness on, I think, Castle and Conundrum, which are near Aspen. And it wasn't so bad because I mostly just felt a little bit nauseated. I don't think I had a bad headache, but I needed to sit down and drink some water and sort of recover. I've had one person where we really had to turn around and go back because he just turned gray, and he tried to tough it out. This is when we were doing a backpack trip. We got up to the campsite and he started feeling sick and wanted to try and see if he got better, and he didn't. So we ended up hiking out at about 2 a.m. This is the best treatment, is just to go back down if you get sick. You know, if you can sit down and you can take ibuprofen. There are some medications for altitude sickness, but I'm not sure that there's any data that supporting that they're really better than just taking ibuprofen. And really the only treatment is to get back down. And sometimes you only need to go down 1,000 feet or so to feel better. The picture on the right here is my friends Scott and Paul, and Paul's sitting down there in the brown jacket. This is on Ellingwood Point. We were going to go across to Blanca, across a traverse, and Paul got altitude sickness, and so we made the good decision to go back down, which was a good decision. And I guess, I mean, the main thing that experience taught me is that you need to tell people if you feel sick so that they know. And then if somebody tells you that they're sick, you really need to watch them. There was a guy on Challenger Point, which is part of the Creston group, who fell. And I think it was primarily because he had altitude sickness and became disoriented. And the people in his group maybe didn't watch him carefully enough. So it's something to think about. If somebody tells you that they feel bad, it may be more than just that they have a headache. They may actually get disoriented and lose their balance and stuff. So it's important to watch out for people. Okay, so those, I think, are the basics. Difficulty, exposure, and commitment are, I guess, terms of art that are used on 14ers.com. So difficulty is how hard is it to travel along the route? So what's the technical difficulty of just doing the route itself, meaning that it's like the climbing difficulty. Exposure is the danger of falling or how severe of a drop you're kind of walking next to. And then commitment is how hard would it be to get back to help or safety at a point during a climb. So I'm going to go through, I do have the list of what the formal definitions are. And then the thing that I think is useful to show are kind of some example pictures of what these different things look like. So these are just the standard climbing difficulties, class 1 through 5. 1 is just a trail where there's a well-defined trail and it's basically flat. 2, you may have to put your hand down occasionally. 3 is scrambling. That's where you're kind of maybe doing dog walking up something where you're using your hands and sort of picking, but you're not climbing yet. And then 4 and 5 are both places where you're actually climbing. And the distinction between 4 and 5 is harder to sort of distinguish than you think. I think I have some good examples, but 4, the fact that something is 4 doesn't mean that it's not vertical. So something, 4 and 5 could both actually be vertical. The way that I think of 4 is you don't really have to do any kind of move or anything. If you're doing class 5, you might have to do a technique like mantling or side pull or stemming or something that turns it into technical rock climbing. Whereas in class 4, it would be like climbing a ladder, but the ladder could be vertical. So it's, that's why there's a distinction between difficulty and exposure, because the difficulty, like you could climb something that's a bouldering problem that's 2 feet off the ground, that's impossible for all but a very small number of elite climbers to do, and there's no exposure. So if you fell, no big deal. You could climb something that's class 3 or 4, but that has extreme exposure where if you fell, you would die. So there's a distinction there, and you have to consider the kind of composition of these 3 different things to decide how difficult the climb is. Exposure. So got a picture of Alex Honnold there on the Thank God ledge. This is just, what's the risk along the route of falling? And in particular, is the route that you're going on, do you have to go through exposure? Mostly what distinguishes these, like low and moderate exposure, you can really avoid going next to something where there's a falling danger, whereas considerable high or extreme, at least some part of the route takes you through something where there's a risk of falling that you really can't avoid. And they're just kind of, these are all somewhat subjective, I guess, but I have some examples of what those look like. Commitment, I like to think of this. I mean, there are psychological components to all of these. Commitment is both, physically, how far away am I, or how long is it going to take me to get back if something goes wrong, to help or safety. And there's definitely a psychological component to this when you're doing a 14er, because the greater the commitment and the farther you are away from being sort of safe and being able to just sit down and relax and recover, can often pay a big psychological toll on you. And I think a lot of times when people make bad decisions, it's out of sort of desperation and discomfort because they're committed to something that they didn't realize would be a huge commitment, and they're out there. And I felt it before myself, which is why I'm bringing it up, like being out and you realize that you're a long way from where you have to go. And I've been in positions where I felt fine physically, but I knew I had to go back another 7 miles and several thousand feet of descending or climbing or something. And And that's something that when that happens, if you have enough experience, you can kind of remember that you've been there before and tell yourself that that it's going to be okay and that you're going to be able to do it. But it's kind of, I mean, it's hard to say exactly what it is. There are different commitment levels on different hikes. I mean, some of them, I have this example here of Mount of the Holy Cross. It's a class 2, which is a relatively easy hike, and there's not really much exposure on it, so there's not a big falling danger. But actually, a lot of people have to be rescued off of this climb because they underestimate how big the commitment is and how long it's going to take them to do the climb. So the particular challenge is that when you go up, you have to climb Half Moon Pass, which is maybe 1,000 feet of elevation gain, and then you go down to East Cross Creek and lose 1,000 feet of gain, and then basically, if you start from East Cross Creek, it's like doing a normal kind of easy class 2 14er from there, where you've got about 3,500 feet of gain that you're going to do. But people go and do it, and if you try and do it in one day, you get back down to the creek and you still got to go up 1,000 feet and down 1,000 feet. And so it's I've talked to a search and rescue person who's had to go out and rescue, several people just because they underestimated how difficult it was going to be to get back up over Half Moon. And so this is, I mean, when Corey and I did this hike, we were aware of that and we did it in one day, but we also made sure that we stopped and rested and ate and filtered water so that when we started back up over Half Moon, we had hydration and everything. And it was still it's a tough climb. 5,600 feet in a day is actually pretty hard, but we made it. And I can certainly see though how people could get in trouble on something, that doesn't have to be a class 4 or 5 thing that has extreme exposure for the commitment to be an issue. This is my class 1. That's Corey with a bunch of tired dogs. I think this is on La Plata, coming from one of the southern routes. And the trail that you can see is just a good example of class 1. There's a well-defined trail. You don't have to do any route finding. You just walk along the trail. On this part of the trail, at least, you're not having to use your hands or anything. So it's easy, quick travel that pretty much anybody could do. And here I've indicated that the exposure is low because there's nothing that you could fall down. If you fell down, you'd just skin your knee or something. Class 2, I guess the one on the right here is on Humboldt, and that's just a nice trail that kind of winds through some talus. I think class 2, generally you're going to be walking through scree or talus of some kind, but you can just walk. You may touch a rock every once in a while as you're climbing, but it's still pretty easy going. And generally, it's also relative easy route finding so that you're not having to do a lot of work to figure out where you're supposed to go. You can see that Karen on the picture on the right. And then one of the points to make here is that the right-hand picture is Humboldt, which is, I think, it's a relatively easy 14er. It has moderate exposure because there is, within some distance of the trail, there's somewhere where you could fall down, but mostly you'd have to like roll 30 feet or something before you would ever fall off of anything. So there's really not exposure. And then the other side is actually the backside of Capitol, and there's no exposure there, and it's class 2, so it's easy to get through that, even though other parts of the climb are more treacherous. But on the Capitol one, the commitment is just extreme because you're above tree line for a really, really long time, and you have to be, for the most part, mentally focused, which can kind of be draining. And so the point is that, you always have to consider all of the factors in gauging how difficult a climb is going to be. There can be class 2 on a really tough climb, and it's tough because of the other factors. So class 3, this is the scrambling. The left-hand picture is near the summit of El Diente, and I think you can see like some of it you can walk up, sort of, maybe somebody could walk up it and claim that it's class 2 because they didn't use any hands, but for most people you would be kind of dog walking, so you'd be putting your hands out in front of you as you're climbing up the rocks, but it wouldn't be very difficult to find foot and hand holds on that climb, and it's just kind of scrambling up, which is actually really fun. It's one of the nicest parts of doing a 14er. I think on the exposure on El Diente is considerable, meaning that you do have to walk past some places where a fall would be dangerous, although it's not too bad. And then the right-hand picture is just another example. I think this is on Schnefel's coming back down from the summit towards the saddle. And I think that one maybe looks worse than it is. The fact that Corey is kind of crab walking, coming down face forward, means that it's still class 3, because if it were class 4 or 5, she'd be turned around facing into the rock. And I don't know. I mean, there's some kind of drop there, so it's, there's some exposure because you wouldn't want to fall down that, but it's actually pretty easy to climb down that section. Class 4, on the left is the crux of Capitol, which is called the knife edge. And there is an example of high exposure. I think it's sort of like two 45-degree angle slopes that come to a point. You've got to walk across maybe 100 yards, or maybe it's not quite that far, but maybe a couple 100 feet of exposed rock. I mean, the one thing about the knife edge is I've seen people like doing handstands on it and walking across, just walking. So you could make the case that the technical difficulty is class 2, I guess, if you wanted to, but the rating on 14ers.com, and I think the Jerry Roach book is class 4. The right-hand picture for me is like the canonical example of extreme exposure. So this is the headwall on the Creston Traverse. So it's coming up Creston Needle, and this is what I meant before about class 4 can be vertical, because it's more or less straight up or down. Like you can I think you can skirt around to the left and maybe keep it class 4 and maybe even high class 3, but the exposure on the left side is in some ways even worse, because there's a much longer drop, I guess, next to the Ellingwood arête. But I mean, this picture shows that you're climbing on conglomerate, so it has these knobs, and so it's sort of not any harder than if you were climbing up a ladder. It's just that the consequences are that you would fall 60 or 80 feet, and then actually the lighter colored slope that you can see below that is also still very steep and drops down. So again, the point I'm trying to make is that just because something is a higher class doesn't mean that it's necessarily less difficult to climb. And kind of to keep on that idea, the right-hand picture here is also on the Creston Traverse, and this is technically a 5.2 move and is technically the crux of the climb, because you have to do a mantling technique to pull yourself up over this rock. The difference is that it's really very moderate and maybe even low exposure, because if you fell off of that while you were climbing it, you probably only fall 8 feet, and it's not even onto like it's not even onto like a ledge or anything. It's really just onto some talus, so it might cushion your fall. So it's much easier, even though it's technically rated more difficult. I think the commitment here is another good example of how that plays a role, because if you did get, like, you know, you're probably not going to die from falling off of this place right here, but if you twisted your ankle, where you are at in the climb means that you either have to go up over needle, which presents sort of the difficulty of that head wall, or you have to go back really 3/4 of the way across the traverse and then down Creston and potentially back up over a pass called Broken Hand Pass. So you're a long way from anywhere. And I have a book that I'll mention at the end that was kind of enlightening, because, you know, anytime that you get hurt on a 14er, you're probably looking at maybe 8 or 10 hours, even in the best circumstances, before somebody could come get you. And so if you can walk out, then you can walk out and you're probably fine. But when we did, I think on Snuffles, actually, someone had twisted or broken their ankle, and they'd been there for a couple of hours, and the EMTs had actually managed to drive their ambulance up close to the trailhead, but then the 2 EMTs were actually kind of morbidly obese, and so they were having trouble even walking around up there, and they ended up having to call search and rescue, which are volunteers who had to, you know, get off work and organize, and they managed to get the guy out, but it took about 8 hours. And that was, you know, he really wasn't even that far from the trailhead. So it's just, that's a consideration for commitment and what the danger is if you get hurt. I think now I generally carry, I have an Iridium satellite beacon, or, you know, if you get a spot or whatever, some kind of emergency beacon that might speed it up. Even if you know, if you had a minor injury, but you couldn't move, then you need someone to come and rescue you on these. I think this is my last what you should do slide. And this is just knowing your limits. The only way to really find your limits is to get out and hike and try and get experience. But when you're considering doing a 14er and whether you should do a route, then, you know, you need the fitness, you may need climbing skills, you need route finding skills for a lot of them. And then are you prepared for the length of time physically that it's going to take to do it, which would be the physical commitment. The psychological is, you know, I think the longer I do 14ers, the more I enjoy them. When I started out, I think the physical demands and kind of the suffering hurt me more psychologically than they do now. So I find that even if I'm on a climb now that's really much tougher than anything I did earlier on, I actually feel better and happier, which should be encouraging. Other questions, are you comfortable with the exposure? Some of these things, there's examples on Capitol, at least 3 of the people had gone across the knife edge and they just didn't want to go back across it because the exposure freaked them out so much. And so they kind of, you know, climbed up somewhere that they couldn't get back down from. And so it's something to be aware of and maybe to experiment with in lower risk situations to see how you feel about that. And, you know, if you're a rock climber, then you probably feel okay and none of this is really gonna to bother you. And then psychological commitment, I talked about what I think of that, just sort of being out there, like you're gonna have a panic attack because you're on a ridge and the sun's beating down on you and you still have 4 hours of hiking left to do. For the physical thing, like the rule of thumb that I've heard is that if you're fit, you can ascend 1,000 feet an hour. You should test this. I routinely kind of time how long it's taking me to do elevation gain because it's the main metric that you use to try and determine how long it's going to take you to do a 14er. So if you go out a ski area and hike up the ski hill. How long does that take you? You can measure it, and that'll probably apply somewhat to trying to do a 14er. So this is the last section, how to hike a 14er. Preparation. So if I'm advising someone, which I guess I am, I would get the right gear. I'd look at it, try and think about, the really essential stuff, make sure that you have gear that's in good working order, and then go out and do some intermediate hikes. I didn't put like easy hikes because I think if you're planning to do a 14er, then you probably already are able to do easy hikes, but you should practice using everything. Make sure your pack is broken in and your footwear so that, you may get blisters, but hope you don't want to wear a brand new pair of boots on a 14er. I put stuff, I guess everybody is maybe in or knows Los Alamos. So East Jemez probably is a really easy trail. Hiking at Pajarito is a great place. And then Atalaya is down by St. John's and Santa Fe. I don't know that it's necessarily easy, but it's a nice steep hike that, kind of mirrors some of the steepness that you would encounter on a 14er. And then some more challenging hikes. I like Nambe Lake just because it's really pretty and it's that's a good kind of easy distance. Deception and Lake Peak are good. I guess Deception, if you're not comfortable with exposure, Deception is really good because you'll get up above tree line and it's kind of looks like what the top of many easy 14ers look like. And then if you want to go out to Lake Peak, you could practice some scrambling and maybe see what, there's some exposure there. So you could see how you feel about that. I put Wheeler before Santa Fe Baldy just because of the distance. So Wheeler's definitely a good training peak, and it's a great way to see how you're going to feel on a 14er because you're pretty close to it. And it's a lot like the terrain of a 14er when you get to the top. But it's also a pretty, there's not a huge commitment on that because it's a relatively short hike and you can get back down pretty quickly. So Santa Fe Baldy is a great way to prepare for any of these because I think it's 13, 14 miles round trip. And you're also getting up above tree line. When you do the summit of that one, you're above tree line for a fair amount of time. And then coming back, you are going, up what I would call like the Twilight Zone hill where you have to slog back up the Windsor Trail to get to the final descent down back to the parking lot. So Santa Fe Baldy's a great one. And I would say, if you're comfortable doing Wheeler and Santa Fe, then you're going to be just fine on the easy 14ers. So if you pick a 14er, this list is certainly not definitive. 3 of these are class 1, 2 of them are class 2. Some of the class 2s are probably easier. Like I said, I did Mount Sherman was the first one that I did. I think it's really one of the easiest ones, but Quandary is also a good one, class 1. So there's no route finding. It's a relatively short hike. The only real disadvantage of Quandary is that it's become so popular that they're thinking about adding a bus line and restricting parking. So if you decide to do that one, make sure you check before you go there to see what you have to do. But this picture on the right is a picture of doing a winter hike up Quandary when there wasn't a whole lot of snow. It was really windy and cold, but I guess I picked these also because most of them are not that hard to get to. Quandary, you drive up to Buena Vista and go up South Park to Alma, and then go over Hoosier Pass, and it's right there. Albert's near Leadville. San Luis is between Sawatch and Gunnison, so that's not too far away from Los Alamos. Sherman, a little bit, I guess it's, actually Sherman might be a good one. I think maybe it's closer than Quandary because you're just going south of Fair Place. You go up through Buena Vista to South Park. And then Bierstadt is again one that's over off of South Park if you go from the south and go up Quinella Pass. I wrote down that for picking ones that are class 1 and 2, according to 14ers.com, there are 35 of them that are class 1 and 2. So there are plenty of different peaks to choose from that keep the difficulty pretty low. And then you should check the exposure and commitment on those. I'm a big planner, so I always plan my trips. I study the route, read Colorado 14ers route description, which is sort of entertaining because it's prose. I look at 14ers.com. I think a lot of people have mixed feelings about YouTube. I think YouTube is great if you've done the other preparation and you want to see exactly what you're getting into. It can be really terrible because I think some people see some guy, doing the handstand on the knife edge and they're like, I can do a handstand. And so maybe I can go do capital, and they get in trouble. So it's, it shouldn't be your only educational information, but it can be useful because you can see what actual landmarks look like and stuff. And there are a lot of good YouTube videos actually where good climbers have done kind of careful analysis and talk about the difficulties, and it's a good resource. And definitely discuss the route with your party. Make a plan. So this is just logistics, where you're going to meet, park. Some of the trailheads need 4-wheel drive, or at least it makes it a lot nicer. So you don't want to beat your car up, and you may need to meet and get into one car to go up. Most places, I guess now, like if you want to go to the Maroon Bells, you actually need a permit to get in there. That may become more of the norm for some of the really popular ones. Yeah, if you're going to take your dog, or dogs allowed, like I know Long's Peak dogs are not allowed, so you need to check, and then you need to check again whether or not a dog can actually do the route, and then discuss the plan with your party. And I mean, definitely I like the 14ers.com, the routes. It has all of the standard routes and then lots of other routes descriptions with pictures. So finally, do the hike. I mean, the important things for that, to make sure that the weather's okay. Smoke can really be crummy if, like there is now. I think there's a fire near Eagle, and I was up in near Leadville this weekend, and I wouldn't have wanted to be out hiking because the smoke would just make it terrible to breathe. So make sure that you check all of that stuff. You can check road and trailhead conditions on 14ers.com. And then importantly, you should always tell someone who's not in your party and not going with you when you're leaving, when you're going to get back, and then where you're going to be, so that if you don't come back, hopefully they can send someone out and go and find you. And then good rule of thumb, as I said, is to get an early start. I think this picture on this page is from the saddle on Missouri. And so we're up at probably 13,000 feet and the sun was just coming up. So I said, you don't always have to do that, but it's a good idea to do it until you get comfortable with thinking about weather. I guess the rest of this is, I'll just go through and show you some pictures of what I liked on 14ers. So this first one is the lake on Capitol. So that's looking at the north face of Capitol, and you can see the ridge that you go up there. Towards the top, you actually go around on the other side of Capitol, but some of that ridge you're going along to get up to the peak. You can see that better here. This is from K2 looking at the route up to Capitol. And so you can see a couple of climbers there. I don't know that you can see the knife edge. It's probably hidden between there, but you go across the knife edge, and once you get across that, you still have a lot of climbing, but it's actually really fun. I enjoyed it a lot. When you get closer, you come off of the ridge and kind of go up this face on the left there to the top. This is looking down from that area near the summit where you've gotten off of the ridge, and then you're going through this kind of, I guess it's mixed like class 3 and 4 rock at that point. Here's Zach Baker nearing the summit of Columbia, looking very svelte, going up the final few steps there. I guess this is probably my favorite feature, and my wife will laugh because it's called the Black Gendorm. And pretty much every time we drive through the San Luis Valley, you can see this feature from what is it, 17 that goes across the Gun Barrel Road. And so I always point out the Black Gendorm. It's just a nice thing. It's the beginning of the sort of real technical difficulties on the Creston Traverse. These are some bighorn sheep to you, and some calves. That's at South Colony Lakes, which is the east side of the Crestones, which is kind of the standard route if you're doing Crestone Peak and Needle and Humboldt. These things are so weird looking in real life, like it's sort of like seeing an alien or something. This is a hoary marmot. I think again that's on the way into the Crestones. I think this is the best picture I've gotten of a marmot so far, but there are definitely loads of them around. Columbines, it's my favorite flower. If you ever get a chance to go and do Bierstadt, there's well, if you do Bierstadt and you go over the Sawtooth, which is I think probably a class 3 climb, you can come down a gully that unfortunately comes down into kind of a bog. The nice part about it is that there are just a million columbines in bloom if you're there at the right time of year. I think more than I've seen anywhere else. Another nice place to see those is on Handy's Peak that's near Lake City. This is on the saddle of Mount Lindsay just after sunrise, looking back towards the east. Okay, this is on Pyramid, and we were coming down, and this goat just like was so interested in us, and he kept following us down, and then he went around that corner, and I stepped down onto the same ledge as he was on, and so he poked his head out and looked at me. But he was pretty funny, quite a character. Okay, this is like I've seen it all. This is on Kulebra, which is the one where it's privately owned, so you have to pay a fee to go do it. But it's an easy one to do too. It's kind of a class 1 or 2. We got up there, and there was this guy, Dylan, who the picture is of with his American flag sunglasses. And we were just standing around, we talked to him, and then all of a sudden he took out his inflatable dinosaur suit and started dancing around and wanted us to take a video of him. And I think it was for some kids that he worked with. So I thought that was a pretty unusual thing to see on the summit of a 14er. This is a red columbine picture from, I think from Handy's. This isn't a great picture, it's kind of underexposed, but that's sort of the crux of the west slopes of Snowmass Mountain, which we did, which is, I mean, it's really beautiful because it's this white granite, and it's a nice climb. I highly recommend that. If you come in from the east side, I think the round trip is quite long. It's 22 miles. I haven't done that route. We stayed in Marble, Colorado, and actually rented an ATV that we then rode up to the trailhead because the road is so nasty. But then that side of it, there's a really nice valley that you hike in and then do Snowmass. This is from Vetterhorn, and I guess this is one where I took some risks and fortunately didn't get in trouble. I think Vetterhorn's a good like beginner class 3 one, but when we went up there, it had snowed and it was icy. And I decided, well, I felt comfortable, so I did it anyway, but definitely probably not a good idea to climb up something when there's ice. But I did get a nice picture. This is Corey celebrating after the coming from El Diente. So the peak in the background is El Diente, and that's the connecting ridge between El Diente and Wilson. That's one of the great 14er traverses. That's Beulah, crashed on top of Red Cloud. So it's kind of a red dog on a red mountain sleeping. This is taken from the summit of Castle, and we did Castle and Conundrum, and you can see a little person down there coming up the ridge and sort of the nice view of the aspen. So it must have been in late September or early October when we did that. This is another one that was taken on top of Conundrum. So I don't know if you can really see it, like this, the route coming up, there's some switchbacks. You come up into this upper basin where there's a lake over here and then go up that, work up that ridge. On this one, we made the mistake of actually, Jerry Roach's book doesn't kind of properly describe the difficulty of coming down the route between Castle and Conundrum, because there's a lot of, it's very loose, and he doesn't really mention that it's kind of bad. I don't recommend doing it. If you do that, it's probably better to just climb back up over Castle and go down the standard route. It's another sunrise near the top of Mount Bedford. The top is right where this rock is, right there. And then this is a picture, I think on the same day after I'd gone over to Oxford and come back, and it was super beautiful, the mountains with the snow on them and the aspens and stuff. It was really a nice day. Zach Baker waiting for me to come up, so he looks a little bit flustered. I think I was particularly slow that day, but we made it. This is looking down into the valley off of Uncompahgre, which is it's a nice one. It's a very beautiful area. That's me and Corey on sort of next to this, some pretty extreme exposure standing there. That's really the best exposure. I mean, you don't have, it's moderate because you don't need to get close to it on the trail. Like you can completely avoid it. But I hung out over the edge and looked down, and it's really a long ways down. I guess just, definitely wear a helmet on anything that's technical or where rockfall might be a danger. This is Corey and me close to the summit of Little Bear. And then you might run into some shady people in one of these. That's Rob Lowry, who I think I have to thank him for suggesting me to give this talk. So I don't know if Rob's on, but thanks. That was on top of Antero, and we were actually hiking up, and Rob pulled up in his Jeep, and so we hiked that one together. It was nice. So finally, this was Corey and my wedding on top of Mount Princeton with Zach and some of our other climbing buddies. So definitely like 14ers, and I very much recommend that you go and try and do one. I'll send out these slides, make them available. So I just put down some of the resources. I mentioned this book, Colorado 14er Disasters. If I actually think it's a good book because it makes some points about how things can go wrong and does some analysis of what went wrong. So if you like reading about accidents in order to try to understand how to avoid them, that's a great book. And then I have Summit Post is another online resource in the Colorado 14ers and 14ers.com. So I think that's it.
All right, thank you so much, Ben. So we have a couple questions that came in on the chat, and anybody is welcome to keep typing into the chat, and I will keep up with those questions. So the first one is, how do your dogs do on things like scree fields?
Well, I mean, it's good that it's funny that you should ask. Like Scree, I mean, it depends on how steep it is. Of course, there are a lot of places where they've been fine going down. But I mentioned that when we did Castle and Conundrum, rather than go back up over Castle, we went down a gully in between them, and it was Scree, and it was horrible. I mean, it was some serious dog abuse. So. Not for all of the dogs. Again, like dogs like people have different tolerance levels for exposure. And so my friend Paul's dog ran down it totally fine, no big deal. Beulah actually sort of got panicky and got stuck. And we basically just had to go down until she got desperate enough to climb down, which then was fine, but it's, it can be a problem. And I think it was a dangerous descent for all of us, because as we were going down, the Scree had some larger boulders in it, and we actually dislodged some. So I think the route description on that one didn't mention anything about how difficult it was. But it's, it can be a problem. And I mean, if you're going to take dogs, make sure that you take some stuff for their feet, because we had on Mount Albert, our dog Zora split a paw or a pad near the end. And I mean, actually the best thing turned out that we just put duct tape on it, and then she was fine to go. But if you're doing longer hikes, it's good to make sure that your dog has done longish stuff and that their feet are pretty tough.
All right. Next, in a scrambling situation, how can you determine a large boulder is stable and not going to give way? Is there a technique, or are the standard routes kind of used enough to have, that you have confidence in the route?
I mean, it's a good question. You can't really know. I mean, I think there are lots of places where you really, if this is one place where maybe watching YouTube would be good, of watching somebody who's doing it, because you'll see a lot of people kind of test every hold, and you really need to do that on some of the routes. Like you tap on it with your foot, see if it wiggles around with your hand, try and do that. If you're on talus, mostly, I guess, on a lot of the standard routes, it is relatively safe. But when we did Snowmass, I mean, the route that we did on Snowmass is not the standard route, but it's also not really a more dangerous or really substantively different route from the standard route. So it's not like it was a harder one. And a guy had been killed, unfortunately, a couple of weeks before we did that, because some large talus shifted and it ended up trapping him. And it was remote enough that they couldn't get people to him. And so he died of exposure. The other kind of exposure would just mean you're out in the cold and the elements. So I don't know that you can know. It's always good to be cautious and mostly test, and then try to move through areas like that sort of as deftly as you can.
Okay, next, specific, which route did you do for Antero?
I'm not sure. I think it was just a standard route. It's let's see. The bad thing about it was, I think it was the standard route. I'm not sure how many routes there are going up it, but it was more or less just a 4-wheel drive Jeep road, all the way up to above tree line. And then I think you get to a ridge and there's sort of a short jaunt out to the summit. And I mean, I say the bad thing is that when we did it, there was so much four-wheel drive traffic on it that it was a little irritating, but I don't know if there's another route up that one or not.
All right. Do you have a favorite Colorado 14er?
Gosh, not really. I mean, I think like some of the fantastically beautiful places you could go, if you go to the Chicago Basin, which is where Sunlight and Wyndham and Eolus, and then there's a 14er that's not rated because of its proximity to Eolus, is North Eolus. That was a great trip. It's really fun because the way that we did it, you ride the train in from Durango, between Durango and Silverton. You ride the train and they drop you off in the woods, and then you hike in maybe 6 or 6.5 miles up into the Chicago Basin. And I think mainly because it's so remote, there's just an awful lot of wildlife there. And so those are really beautiful. And they're also challenging and fun. I think Sunlight maybe is class 4, but it has a lot of nice kind of climbing on good solid rock. Wyndham's maybe a little less technical, but again, there's good solid rock. And mostly I think the same for Eolus. Eolus has a little, like an easy catwalk that you go across to get to that. It kind of reminded me of Pyramid, but with much better rock. So I highly recommend going to the Chicago Basin.
All right. And do you have plans to do your last peak, and when? And are you going to have any particular celebration?
Oh, no. So I want to do the Bells Traverse. I did Main Peak, Maroon Peak several years ago with my friend Paul, and I actually soloed North Maroon last year, which was great. Like that was a really fun hike. But I'd like to do the Traverse, and so I've sort of started looking at that. I watched really a complete video of the whole Traverse last night, and so we're planning to do that. We have a permit to go up and park starting on August 1st, and we're going to hike into Crater Lake and camp there, so that shaves off about 800 feet of the elevation, and then we'll get an early start and try and do the Traverse. And then I think like the last one will be Longs, and since we're in Boulder now, it's really close, so we'll probably just wait till September. A lot of times in September you get a weather pattern where it's just blue sky the whole day long, still pretty warm. So sometime in September we'll be doing that. And I guess also we're doing, so like in terms of just to say this, like we still train. We have been doing a climb, we did a climb this Sunday called Mount Sanitas, that it's just about 1,200 feet, but it's in a mile. So it's a good steep climb. That's here in Boulder. And then I think I'm actually going to do the Arapaho. There's an Arapaho Peaks Traverse that's like class 3 and 4 this weekend. We're going back to South Colony Lakes to do Mount Humboldt with a couple of friends who wanted to do an easier one. So that's a good training thing. And then, a couple of weeks after that, we'll do the Bells Traverse. So that's sort of what we got planned right now.
All right, so there's two similar questions. One is about, are all the climbs, doable without rope and protection? And then someone asked, have you brought rope and protection on any of your climbs?
The main problem with doing ropes is just that you have to weigh that against, I guess, the commitment, because you're carrying more weight. And then if you want to set up anchors on any of these things, there are a couple of challenges. There are a couple of fixed anchor positions on some of them. So for instance, if you wanted to do the Bells Traverse and you went north to south, there's a point where you could take like a 30-meter rope and rappel down some of the main difficulty there. You can actually rappel off of Creston Needle down that head wall that I showed. We have not done that just because it's, I mean, especially, I guess they're, you know, those are short places. If you don't mind the exposure, they're not particularly hard really to climb. I mean, that's, you know, the class 4 on that head wall is the most exposed thing I've really ever been on. And so it's all psychological. I mean, if it weren't where it is, you wouldn't really worry about climbing. Oh, I guess you'd worry about climbing up it when you got to the top, but it's not difficult climbing. So we haven't done it. But I mean, things like some of the, like Little Bear Blanc on that traverse, which is also, I mean, extreme exposure the whole time. It would just be too time consuming to try to rope up. And if you're going to do it, you know, you might as well just suck it up and do it. But I mean, you could, and you can do all of the standard routes you can do without ropes. And so the traverses are not standard routes. Those are sort of extra things.
Okay, so I think that was the last of the questions that have come in, and I'll keep watching, but thank you so much again, Ben, for sharing with us tonight. Lots of really good information. And yeah, please join us for other talks and presentations. And I think if that's it, just, yeah, lots of people coming onto the chat saying thank you again, Ben, and thanks for all the super useful information, and thanks. So, all right.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thanks for letting me share. I'm happy to do it.
All right, and good luck on your last couple, your last climb. And
yeah, hopefully you won't read about me in the paper.
no, we can't wait to hear about the successes.
Yeah.
All right, well, with that, I'll say goodnight, everybody, and we'll see you next time. Thanks again.